Hey folks, so today we're going to look at a CSS framework called Bulma. So what is a CSS framework? So a CSS framework is, I guess you can look at it as a piece of software that, say, is created by either yourself or someone else, that you can use in your projects to help give you a consistent and professional looking style across your pages. I think you've probably noticed with the CSS we've been working on for the last 3 or 4 weeks that it all looks fairly amateurish, kind of 1990s website-ish, if even. And that's because to get places that a designer might be happy with CSS, it can be quite tricky and can take a lot of practice. Whereas a CSS framework essentially will give us almost a default styling for all of our classes that we might use, and essentially kind of give us the ability to create elements that look like different components on our web page. And a CSS framework may also incorporate the ability, which Bulma does, to be very responsive and work on a mobile device, desktop, iPad, right out of the box without you having to do too much. And you'll see in the labs how that works today. One of the CSS frameworks I would have been very familiar with back in the day was released by Twitter. It was called Bootstrap. And to me, it was almost like just unlocking CSS, to be honest. It was a kind of a big step for me in my web dev career. It was kind of finding that and using it and figuring out how it worked. And because I was always more of a, I guess, API backend cloud based engineer. It's kind of just where I liked to work. But the likes of these frameworks gave me an opportunity to create, web applications that would look pretty good. Now it does get to a point where you can look at different web pages and which frameworks they're using, but if it's an application required to do some task, does it matter? And potentially, if you're getting started on a product or getting started in a company, maybe that doesn't matter yet. And a lot of these frameworks you can customize, so you can start moving out of them as well when you get into a place where you're more design focused. So yeah, so I've kind of mentioned everything there, but the aim of frameworks is kind of to provide a common structure, so that developers don't have to redo everything from scratch. So everything is, you have kind of pre-built blocks that you can use, and that's kind of what Bulma will give to you as well. So these are popular frameworks from, they're quite dated at this point, to be honest. So I won't even talk about too much of them too much. I've already kind of talked about Bootstrap, but we will talk about Bulma in depth today, and you will use it in the lab. So as you can see, it mentions a mobile first approach, which essentially just means it is responsive and will work, in a mobile application as well as, in a mobile browser as well as your browser on your laptop. And it is free and open source, which is one of the main things when you're looking at using a framework that you might tie yourself into a small bit. It does claim no CSS knowledge required. I mean, I'd refute that small bit, but it definitely lets you, kind of releases you from thinking about CSS rules and more into how your page is made up, um, and the different components you can make with Bulma. So Bulma is built primarily around the Flexbox, which I don't think we've looked at, but it was kind of an independent learning exercise in your first assignment. But Bulma utilizes it to essentially, do its columnar layout. And if we take a look at, it uses classes as well. So you will see everywhere we're using Bulma, we'll be using different classes of columns, column, box, button, image. Well, I guess figure, actually, I think it is. And different things like that. So the big thing you'll see today in the first lab is just using columns. And then in the second lab, it's a bit more involved, where we take one of our websites that we've built in our labs and convert it from regular CSS to Bulma. Basically, almost delete our CSS files. We won't see them anymore. We just import the Bulma CSS file. So yeah, as I mentioned, we only need one CSS file to use Bulma, and we'll kind of go through how that works. So Bulma is a CSS framework. The word library is used there. I'm not so sure it is a library, but it basically provides CSS classes to help us style our own HTML. It also does a really good job of helping us keep our HTML presentation layer code with, our structure code abstracted or separate from our kind of presentation layer CSS. So we still get the separation of concerns that you hear software engineers talking about all the time. So for instance, with Bulma, we would use the class of container a lot to generally just create a container for elements that, will have a nice looking margin, have some nice padding, might have some drop shadow and things like that. Most Bulma elements as well will have alternate styles. So you can see, as we dig into it more, we're going to work with, say, create a button with a class of button in Bulma. And then we can have a class after that that will then modify it. So it could be is primary, is warning, is alert, and that kind of thing. And your button will be colored differently like that. You'll mainly see modifiers with the is and has kind of prefix on them. So if we were just to kind of jump ahead into maybe what Bulma is, and we'll come back a bit now in a second, but say we have our button here, and there's no CSS applied to this apart from the class of button, and this is coming from Bulma, and we'll show you how to import Bulma now in a sec. So we have this button up here. If we use the Bulma button class, you can see we have nice rounded edges. It's just kind of a white with black text. If we use the modifier of is primary, Bulma's primary color is kind of turquoisey green. Let's just call it green for now, because I'll probably get it wrong. And you can see some modifiers down here. Is primary, is link, is info, is success, is warning, is danger. And if you're kind of design orientated, you might not like this type of thing where it's very opinionated, where even the class names, in my opinion, are quite opinionated. Where you have is warning, is danger, is success. For me, I'm not sure what that means, but well, I do know what it means. But it kind of seems slightly removed from content and CSS, in that not every red thing means danger, but you might have danger in your class, in your HTML files, which can get a bit confusing and might confuse the purpose of, what you're building. But that's a trade-off with using a framework. With using a framework, you're usually in the realm of something that is opinionated. And if you are also opinionated, it can kind of maybe grind you down a bit. Maybe it might annoy you that you have to do things like this. But you're getting a lot of stuff for free. So we just kind of go with the flow here until it gets to a point where the opinionated design is too restrictive for us. But that's not going to happen this semester. Not in this class anyway. We're going to fully embrace Bulma. So just another kind of different example of how you might modify a button using modifiers. So something like is small, medium, large, and then is outlined, or something like is loading is quite nice. And then also disabled. You can see here examples then of combining those modifiers. So is danger, is outlined, is large, that kind of thing. I think it's also disabled. We'll see. Okay, so if we were to think about the bundle store, and this is done in the lab, so we'll kind of gloss over it here, and you can dig in deeper into the lab. So we have our 11 includes directory, and we have our footer, our header, our layout, our nav, our sidebar. We also have our CSS directory. We can practically delete that now because we don't need our CSS directory anymore. Now, we can reintroduce it to augment or introduce new styles, or we could even create our own modifiers to work with Bulma, which would be dangerous. That if Bulma is updated at some point, your modifiers might start getting a bit weird, but we'll see. So when we're working with Bulma, all we need to do, and this version here is old, we're on version 102 now, the lab has been updated, is put this link element into our head. And now we have all of Bulma's components available to us on our webpage. So this is basically then working through the setup that you go through in the lab to how you make Bulma work as a responsive web page. Explain in the lab what the viewport is. That just helps with mobile devices and being responsive. We've come across the doc type before. And then we just essentially remove all of our classes from our code and remove all of our style sheets because we don't need them anymore. And when we remove, we end up going from this to this, we're back unstyled again, and you'll do this in the lab. So just going through the slide deck there, I thought it'd be a good idea to maybe just show the Bulma website at this point, because I think I've been kind of talking about it without showing you, exactly what it is. And if we go, so this is the Bulma website, bulma.io, and we go to our documentation, and we're looking at our different elements. And if we were to do something like box, let's say. So you can see here, I'm actually in dark mode, so I'm going to switch to light mode because these things are a bit easier to see in light mode. Bulma gives you light and dark mode support right out of the box, which, is a really big deal because it's something, and I go through how to turn it on and off in the lab and kind of explain in the lab as well that, dark mode is not just changing the background. You have to change all of the other fonts and colors and all that kind of stuff to work with it. But yeah, if we just take a look at some of the components in Bulma, card is more of an interesting one actually. And there is a challenge in the lab to implement a card. So if we would think about a card, we might think about something that maybe looked like Twitter back in the day, where we have a profile picture, a name, maybe a picture above it, and some text. And you can see this probably already looks a lot more professional than any of the websites we've developed over the last few weeks. So you can see drop shadow across down here. It might be hard to see on the video, but you will see it. We have rounded edges, we have drop shadow, we have, the page is starting to feel a lot more textured, I would say. And then Bulma guides you through using all the different classes. So you can see we're using a class of card here, a class of card header, a class of card header title, and these are all coming from Bulma. scroll down a small bit. Just so we can see different things. And you can see on the left-hand side here, then we have things like breadcrumbs, which is this list going across the top of the page where you place breadcrumbs of where you've been and where you can go back to. We had a look at card. You can have a look at something like drop down. You can see this already looks like, a nicer looking drop down than you might get if you were to just use a form field, which we haven't really covered forms yet, so you probably haven't seen them anyway. Different things like different menus, on the left hand side here. This itself, rather than implementing our own, menu, our menu styling like we have been, we can use a list over here. You can see we're using an unordered list, a list. So you can see we're still using the semantic elements, which is important. You will find yourself using more div elements when you're using a framework like Bulma, but you should still keep everything as semantically correct as possible, because you still need that ability to, support, I guess, accessibility, machine readers and things like that, and to help developers understand what's going on. So even though, we have this menu, we have our menu label, we have our menu list, and all those types of things, we still want to keep our elements semantically correct. So you can take a look down through a few of these. So we would have had a bit of pain maybe creating something like this in our previous, but really all we're doing here is using classes such as message, message header, and message body. So you can see a kind of component kind of choices, the front end that we're doing here. We'll just have a look at kind of the nav bar, create our own nav bar. We look at this now in a sec in the notes anyway. But yeah, like that is just a quick introduction as to what Bulma actually is. I was just kind of going through the slides there and kind of realizing that and showing you straight up what it is, more showing you the results. So I thought I'd just jump out there. So we'll go back in here. So all we've done at this point is include Bulma in our website, but we've also taken out all the existing styles. So what happens and what we've done with our main and in the past, is have to set different widths and different margins for that element. But what we're going to do is use the container class. And you'll do this in the lab too. If you look at the left-hand side, there's no margin here. There's no margin here. Whereas if we look here, we have a margin because we've just used the class container. And you will see this in the lab as well, as I was saying. And that might seem like something small, but it's a very good start to make your website a lot more relaxed, even just looking at that. And you have a lot less to manage. So when you want to use a container, really all you do is use the class container. There's different classes you can use as well, and these may not even exist on the newer versions of Bulma. And so yeah, very simply, a container is a simple utility element, center content on larger viewports. And yeah. So I think the big thing about Bulma and the big breakthrough you need to get today is how Bulma is built around the whole idea of columns, and how it's so much easier to comprehend and deal with than the CSS grid that we've been working with, which I just find so painful. It's probably one of those things that really put me off CSS back all those years ago. So Bulma has its own grid system called Columns, powered by Flexbox, as I mentioned. And you might say, well, so what, John? You can make some columns. Who cares? But we can do a lot with this very easy ability to create columns and responsive columns as well. So that when, I make the screen smaller, they stack on top of each other, and they auto kind of respond or flex with the screen. So if we were to look at a simplified version of code to do this, you're going to do this in the lab. You'll see there's a bit more to it than what the example is below. And there's just a bit more usage of Bulma to get something green and rounded and things like that. So essentially we have it's a div here because there's no semantic meaning to the page at the moment. But this could be our main, or this could be our footer, it could be our header, it could be anything. And again, you should always try and defer to the semantically correct element as opposed to just using a div. But this is just the documentation and it's kind of just plucked out of thin air, so there's no semantic meaning here. So we have a div with a class of columns, and its direct descendants are divs again with the column class. So just notice the S at the end here. So this is the kind of parent, this is the columns, and this will be like a row of columns. And so then, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. And you can see when we render them on a page, we get a quarter of the page for each column. So they're always equal width if you do not define a width. So that's nice, looks nice. And you'll play around with that in the lab and you'll get an idea of how it works. I've broken down a very simple example, which I didn't actually have last year, so I just kind of made it last week to try and make the introduction to Bulma a bit easier. So speaking of sizes, you can define the size of each column individually. However, if you define the size of some of them, the rest of the columns will just adjust to take up the rest of the space. So we can use, modifiers of is full, is 3/4, is half, is 1/4 to define the size of our columns. So you can see the documentation is nice in that, we have a nice little usage of the modifiers inside of what we're actually filling up here, or the space we're taking up here. And you can see the rest of the columns are just kind of like automatically laid out. And you can see here's just some more kind of fractional based modifiers. So you can use fifths there. We're using quarters on the previous one. And one thing we need to understand or try and understand, and what helps everything a bit easier, is that we can also do, is 1, is 2, is 3, all the way up to 12. And when you're thinking of a Bulma column, you must always think of it as it is 12 columns. And, if you use half, it's going to be 6. If you use full, it's going to be 12. Just try and think of everything as a fraction of 12. So you can use the quarters, you can use the fifths, but you can also use the is 1, is 2 for a lot more granularity like that. So to get rows, the first thing you can do is just use new column elements. Correction, new columns. Don't forget the S elements. So I always, when I'm talking about it, it's kind of natural for me to say it like that, but each columns element is a new row, as you can see down the bottom here. You can also do a multi-line columns where, as you can see, like we're using a lot of fractions here, and all these are going to add up to more than 1. So we're using fractions in this point, so 1 is the most. But what happens in that case, if you don't use a multi-line, is it just kind of gets cut off at some point, the point you reach 1. We'll do that in the lab just to show you how it looks. But if you use multi-line, you can see that it kind of flows across the page with the width of each kind of row here always being 1, or if you're using, the specific numbers, 12 columns across. So something like this, you can imagine if you had an unknown number of pictures that you wanted to render in a gallery, they could all be is 1/4, so they're that size or whatever, and you could loop over them and add them to your page and not worry about adding new lines. Just in here, just programmatically keep adding new photos, that kind of thing. All right, so I guess we'll jump into a small bit of the lab here, but again, it's in the lab, and all the source code is there for you to work with. I think I'm having trouble with zips downloading, so I might have to put those in Slack, but we'll see. But we're going to add columns to the header, main, and the footer. So this is our, sorry, this is our layout.njk that we'd be somewhat familiar with. A bit of a complicated kind of section in here. But we would have done all this in the lab. And if we take a look at what Bulma we might have, so up here we're linking in Bulma. Then here we have the class of container, which will just center our content and make sure it doesn't go the whole way across the screen because the screen is too wide. We have our columns. We have our column, which is 3/4. We have our column, which is 1/4. You can see we have our section and a side, and we have our main. So if we take a look and see what happens there, well, not yet. I guess we're going to edit the header as well. But we were modifying the layout page, and you can see what it looks like here. So you can see this is where the container makes a difference. And then over on the right hand side, it's centered. So then we have one columns set up. So, and this one is 3/4. So our main content is 3/4. And our side content is 1/4, I believe. We'll go back and double check that. Yeah. So here's our section class there, which is our main content, 3/4, and then our side is 1/4. And they're set up as a column. And so we have no CSS file for this. We're using the one from Bulma. You can see this might be something that some people feel more at home with than working with raw CSS. So there's a lot of things you end up getting for free and opinionated things you get for free as well. And, we get a lot of options for different content areas, such as hero banners and footers, where, a hero is something you would typically have across the top of the page. And, it would have a title and a subtitle. And potentially then you could integrate your navigation into it as well. So something like this would be a full height hero, where what we'll work with in the lab is creating, this hero banner with a title, subtitle. There could be an image in there too. And we have a nice tab style nav bar integrated into it. And you will see with how little effort we'll be able to do that with just a little understanding. Like the main thing about a framework is you have to just understand how to use it, I guess. So if we were to look kind of at our header, we would have a class of hero, class of title, and a class of subtitle. And these are all coming from Bulma, and you'll see those in the docs, and you saw the docs are very component orientated, which will show you which classes to use and when. We'll also use Bulma in the lab to create a footer, and you can see we have a class of footer, and that's a Bulma class as well. And you can see that we have a class of footer. We have content in there as well, which will just make the div and the paragraph look more like, I guess you can't really see it on the screen. You'll probably be able to see it in the lab. You can see there's, a kind of a fading color in the background there. It's just a shading, I guess is probably a better word for it, and has center text as well. So you can see we're centering the text using a has modifier. Okay, so what we'll move to next is just having another look at some of the modifiers, and I think hopefully you'll be kind of reasonably impressed with what you can get for free here with Bulma. So when we're talking about the likes maybe of a hero or a button or a nav header or anything like that, or a footer, and if we're using a Bulma class, we can change the color of, let's say, the text in it by using the has modifiers. So has text white, has text black, and has text primary. We're into the opinionated coloring names down here. And you can't go on forever here. So you'll have some classes that you can use and some classes that you'd like to potentially modify. But embracing the framework is what we're going to do first. So you can see over here, we have different kind of gradients as well of how we might augment our text color using a has modifier. To change the background color, say, of a button or a hero, we have something like has background white, has background primary, has background info, and the opinionated colors there. So you can use each color in a light or dark version as well. And this is all in the documentation, so you don't have to kind of remember all this, but it's good to have in your head that when you have a modifier, you can make it light or dark as well. So Bulma also has a content class to handle content, which might sound obvious, but when you can't use the CSS class you just want to directly use HTML tags, you use content as the container. And you can put pretty much all the kind of P, list, heading, tags we've been dealing with inside of a container that has a content. Well, I guess you could put the class directly on the element as well. So here's an example of content Bulma element with the supported HTML tags. So when we just set things to content, we had, or before we did, we have all this happening here where we just really have no style applied. And as soon as we wrap this whole view here, so all the text with class content, it starts using its default stylings for headers and also for lists, which we kind of lost even the default styling when we kind of wrapped everything in a Bulma container. So Bulma box is a white box, or depending if you're using dark mode or not, might not be white, but let's just say we aren't using dark mode. So a white box to contain other elements. It's a simple container, and you'd be able to see it more on your own screens when your browser, when you're playing around with things. But we just have a div with some text here. So there could be a P as well. And we have a rounded box with some drop shadow around it, which just looks nicer and more contained than just text floating randomly in the infinite of whiteness. We haven't done any really form programming yet, but box is used a lot as well when you're working with form elements. So a form element is just something that has a label and an input associated with it. So here we have an email and a password form element. So here we have Bulma box. So without class box, we have no kind of drop shadow around our content here. But you can see here, if we add the class of box, all our content is within a box there. I kind of feel like probably box probably suits, a kind of secondary or side content a bit more. Probably not the main content, but it kind of depends on your preferences and style there. One of the most useful kind of classes you're going to get in Bulma is the usage of image. So Bulma utilizes image containers. So they're precisely sized image areas so that if your image doesn't load, it still retains the size. Or while your image is loading, let's say it's being pulled down from an S3 bucket or pulled down from a content delivery network, your page doesn't jump around when images get loaded or whatever. So you can see we have some default sizes we can pick. So image is 16 by 16, is 128 by 128. And I think there's some aspect ratio modifiers you can use as well. One cool thing you'll do in the lab is your images will go rounded, which as a CSS newbie back in the day when a framework did this for me, I was pretty happy. So you can see we have a figure where our image is 128 by 128. And in there, we have our image that is rounded. And that's all we need to do to make the image rounded. So it'll crop around the image. Oh yeah, so jumping ahead of my own slides, here's the responsive image ratios. So you won't know what the exact dimensions, but you know the ratio. You can use the aspect ratio modifiers. The only requirement here is for the parent element to have a specific width defined. So you can see here, 1 by 1, 5 by 4, 4 by 3, and you might be used to hearing things like 16 by 9, that kind of thing, and pretty sure that exists as well within Bulma. Okay. So that was, I guess, colors, images, and modifiers. So we'll look now at how we can use Bulma to help with styling of our navigation, which may have been possibly the most complicated thing. Well, honestly, grid was the most complicated thing we did and the most head-wrecking thing we did. So columns helps us there. And hopefully when you're working in the lab, you'll see what I mean by how less head-wrecking it is. It's not a very technical or engineering term, but I think we'll all agree. So we won't, pretty sure, we'll do a small bit of navigation in the lab. But there's a little bit in this that we won't get to until next week. And I'll highlight that when we see it. So there's a couple of ways of implementing navigation in Bulma. The first is the nav bar, which Bulma used themselves on their own page. I think their new page might not use it though. And then we have the hero style navigation, which we will do in our second lab today. So the nav bar in Bulma is a responsive horizontal nav bar that can support images, links, buttons, and dropdowns. So I won't go through, I won't go through it too much. But there's a lot of semantic meaning classes in the nav bar to kind of get your head around. So your nav bar can have a brand, it can have a burger, and believe it or not, this up here is a burger. Bun, meat. Bun, meat. And your nav bar typically, when you move into a mobile device, will responsively adjust itself to look like a hamburger menu. And so when you're in the menu itself, you can have a start, an end, and a few items that you can use in there. So links, drop downs, and dividers, and there's probably more now. So when we're to think of the navbar brand, it starts on the left-hand side. Unsure what you can change about that at the moment off the top of my head, but we're going to have the class of navbar, and we're going to have a navbar brand, and you can see here's what Bulma uses their navbar brand. So the navbar brand is on the left-hand side of the navbar, and I can have a navbar item, navbar burger, and it's always visible. It's recommended to only use a few navbar items to avoid overflowing horizontally on small devices. So yeah, you'll kind of notice that when you play around with things. We won't get too much into optimizing things like this for mobile, but you'll see it'll mostly work. I think it's next week. We'll create our own music clone of a music service that uses that responsive behavior, so you can see it working, and we won't focus too much on it. And you'll also see a bit of a hack in there as well to get it to work using JavaScript, which kind of defeats the purpose of frameworks. So I'll see how you feel about that then. So the navbar burger is a hamburger menu, which is this on the right hand side here. And it appears as the last child of the navbar brand. So it has to contain 3 empty span tags in order to visualize the hamburger, line, or the cross. So confused me for a little bit when I was working with that one, but we will work with it in the lab next week. So then we have the idea of a navbar start and an end. And the navbar start will appear on the left. So we have over here, which is our home, documentation, and more. So that's our navbar items there. And a navbar end will appear on the right. So we have our buttons in there. So navbar items we can use. So we can use links. We can use items, I guess, for the brand logo. And we can use, so we have see our class of navbar link, and we have a class for navbar dropdown. So if I just go back, that's how you get a dropdown here. You're going to use your navbar dropdown, and there's styles specifically to work within the navbar itself. So you can fix the navbar to either the top or the bottom of the page, by using its fixed top, its fixed bottom modifiers, and that kind of thing. So we won't really muck around with that too much, but you can give it a go. So it was just a quick introduction, and we'll do all this in code. A lot of it next week. We'll do a little bit of the hero nav in this week's lab, if I'm recalling correctly. But if we were to use something like a hero banner to contain our navigation, so we would use the Bulma hero. So we'd have the hero head, the hero body, and the hero footer. And you can see here we have a brand here, and we have some links over here, but we also have navigation kind of components down here. So we start to kind of see in this case, a lot of different divs and things like that, which can get a bit confusing. So, we have our hero class here with the modifiers of primary and his medium. And, so we start our header here then, where we have our nav bar and our hamburger. And, oh yeah, I guess we have more items here as well. And the nav bar end, where are we going here? So this will end up on the right-hand side of the page. We have our home, examples, and documentation. So I'm going to go back and look at that. So there's our home and examples and documentation appearing on the right-hand side. So again, I think this is easier when you're working through the code yourself. So definitely do that. I feel like I'm talking a lot where I probably, it might be better for me to show this working in code, but I don't think we cover the amount that we needed to cover in the right time. But I will walk through some of the labs and show you how they're working. So the Bulma hero body So we're going to focus in on that here. So we have the class here of hero body, and then we have a container with our title and our subtitle. So you can see our title and our subtitle with different stylings, and they're centered as well. So, that's quite nice. And they're centered because we have the has text centered modifier on our container. And you should be noticing that we're not seeing really any CSS rules at all at this point. We're just kind of using what the documentation tells us to do. And you don't have to remember that a body, should have a title and a subtitle. A hero body, excuse me, should have a title and a subtitle. The documentation on the Bulma website does a great job of showing you all these little recipes that work together. So that's always something you should have open when you're using Bulma, unless you have a photographic memory that's even crazier than photographic, probably. And so then our hero footer, so the footer on our banner essentially, becomes our navigation links. So you can see here, we have our footer, we have a tabs class, which is coming from Bulma. We have our container, which allows us to do our list. So we have our list here. And now you can see we have the class is active here. And we in our lab, we'll go through the whole is active part as well, moving that around. Okay, so that was a bit of a whirlwind through Bulma. Honestly, get stuck into the labs. As I said, I introduced this nice kind of getting started introduction into it, where we really start from the basics, working with very simple Bulma examples, as some of the other ones might have seemed a little bit complicated to you as you're working through them there, or as I was talking through them. And so we just go through columns and rows, and then, we get into the more kind of complicated migrating from our CSS into a Bulma driven or Bulma styled app store. And you can already see it looks a lot better. We did a pretty good job with raw CSS, but you will kind of see we've now completely dropped all of those 4 CSS files, and now we're just using Bulma, and we probably have a better, more scalable solution. So best of luck with that. Best of luck with getting your assignment up. And yeah, I will catch you in the next one, which I guess is after our reading week. Cheers, folks.